Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. In this session I will be talking about the development of the uterus and the uterine tubes. So you need to know about three important words when you discuss about uterus and uterine tubes. One is the paramesonephric duct. Okay, paramesonephric duct. The second one is the urogenital sinus, and the third one will be the sinovaginal bulb or with the vaginal plate. So paramesonephric duct, the urogenital sinus, and the sinovaginal bulb or vaginal plate. These are the three terms which we will look for while we evaluate a short note on the development of the uterus and the uterine tube. So let's see what one by one how the uterus and the uterine tubes are developed in the human body. So if this is a cross section, if you just take a cross section of the fetus, I have drawn only one half. Before you view this session, please see the session on the development of the testes and ovaries. So then you will understand this cross section in detail. For the time being, I am just mentioning roughly about the position of the paramesonephric duct and the gonads. For that purpose, I have drawn a cross section of the fetus. So this is the dorsal mesentery which is suspending the gut tube, and this is the dorsal aspect and this is the ventral aspect, and on either side you can see a mesonephric ridge which is divided into a genital fold which is medially and the tubal fold which is laterally. So what you get in the genital fold, you have the developing gonad in the genital fold, and laterally you have the tubal fold with the main two tubes, the mesonephric duct and the paramesonephric duct. So the mesonephric duct is lying medially, and lateral to it you have the paramesonephric duct seen. And the paramesonephric duct is seen in females, which is developing into the uterine tubes and the uterus. So let's see how this paramesonephric duct is formed. This is the coelomic cavity, that is, you are just taking a sagittal section and you are just opening up the abdominal cavity. So what will you see? You can see the whole of the abdominal cavity lined by the coelomic epithelium. So this is the posterior wall of the abdominal cavity. Imagine. Then what happens is, first you imagine the coelomic epithelium as a single plate of paper or single sheet of paper. Then a part of it on either side evaginates or invaginates into the cavity. And what happens? So this is first a sheet of plate, then it invaginates into the cavity, and later it forms a tube or duct and it gets separated from the coelomic epithelium. So this is the sheet of coelomic epithelium, then invagination happens, then these two ends fuse together and get separated from the posterior wall, and that is how you get the two paramesonephric ducts. So what happens? There is an opening at the cephalic end of the paramesonephric duct. This is the opening at the cephalic end of the paramesonephric duct, and this will explain why the uterine cavity is communicating with the peritoneal cavity through the fimbrial end of the uterine tube. Okay, so the paramesonephric duct invaginates into the cavity and gets separated as two ducts on the dorsal aspect of the coelomic cavity. Now what happens is it descends down, and this is the mesonephric duct, the position of the mesonephric duct. So this formation of the paramesonephric duct occurs at about 6th week of intrauterine period, and it descends down, and by around 8th week of intrauterine period it will cross from the lateral to the medial aspect and in front of the mesonephric duct. This is the mesonephric duct. Okay, so in front of the mesonephric duct, the paramesonephric duct will cross from lateral to medial. And then what happens? It will descend further down so that the two paramesonephric ducts on either side will come closer by around 3rd month of intrauterine period. So we can say roughly by the end of first trimester, we are seeing the development of the uterus and the uterine tube. And now we can see that there is a urogenital sinus. So where is the urogenital sinus? Developed from you have to imagine the gut tube, the primitive gut tube. There is a cranial end and a caudal end. At the caudal end, the dilated portion, you call it as cloaca, which is actually divided into a urogenital sinus anteriorly and the posterior primitive rectum by a septum. What do you call that septum? That is known as the urorectal septum. Okay, so this paramesonephric duct is actually lying in the septum, in the urorectal septum, between the urogenital sinus in front and the primitive rectum behind. If we take a sagittal section, it is not possible to show the urorectal septum. The primitive rectum which is lying behind. Okay, so you have the urogenital sinus in front, you have the primitive rectum behind, in between you have the urorectal septum, and these two paramesonephric duct are coming and lying in this urorectal septum. Clear? And the paramesonephric duct, the lower part is blind. Okay, it's not having an opening, it is blind, and it is actually bulging onto the posterior wall of the urogenital sinus. You have the urogenital sinus in the anterior aspect, and you can see that the paramesonephric duct will come like this and it will bulge into the posterior wall of the urogenital sinus, and this bulge will cause a tubercle in the urogenital sinus, and that is known as the Mullerian tubercle. So we just mentioned about the paramesonephric duct. It's descent down, it's crossing from lateral to medial side, and these two ducts are coming closer by the 3rd month, and the distal or the caudal blind end projects into the urogenital sinus as the Mullerian tubercle. Now let's see what are the parts of the paramesonephric duct. We can see there is a cephalic end which is almost vertical, then there is an intermediate portion which is almost horizontal, and then again you have the caudal vertical end. Okay, so by about 3rd month of intrauterine period, the caudal ends of the paramesonephric duct which are lying on either side will fuse together so that it will form a single uterovaginal canal. Okay, so it will form a single uterovaginal canal, and this fusion happens in the caudocranial direction, that is from the caudal end towards the cranial end, so that the cephalic end will remain unfused, and these are forming the future uterine tubes. Okay, so the caudal end, the two paramesonephric ducts which are lying closer fuse together by around 3rd month so that it will form a single canal, that is known as the uterovaginal canal, and the direction of fusion is from caudal end to cranial direction, caudocranial direction. And we can see that some of the cells of the paramesonephric duct, the mesodermal cells, will proliferate inside at the caudal end, forming the vaginal cord. Okay, so the caudal end of the uterovaginal canal will be forming a solidified mass due to the proliferation of the mesodermal cells which are lying in the paramesonephric duct, so that the canal is actually closed as a single rod-like tube, that is the vaginal cord, from which you have the development of vagina. So let's see what is happening to the upper part of the uterovaginal canal. So there is a cranial end and a caudal end for the uterovaginal canal. So the cranial end, this is the cranial end, that is actually forming the uterus and cervix. Okay, so the cranial end of the uterovaginal canal, the fused paramesonephric ducts form the uterovaginal canal. The cranial end of the uterovaginal canal forms the uterus as well as the cervix. So during the fetal period and the postnatal period, the cervix is roughly twice as longer than the uterus. The cervical portion is longer than the uterus, roughly more than 2 times. And what happens is, during puberty, the uterus will elongate by the fusion of some more portion of the paramesonephric duct, so that it forms a fundus incorporating a portion of the paramesonephric duct, and ultimately the uterus will be larger. That happens only during puberty, and the cervix will be shorter compared to the uterus. So, when we say the lining of the uterus, that is the endometrium, and the lining of the cervix, they are from the paramesonephric duct, which is mesodermal in origin. And what about the myometrium, that is the musculature of the uterus? Again, it is derived from the genital cord surrounding it, and that is also mesodermal in origin. So, we can say that the entire uterus and cervix are mesodermal in origin. So, why I am stressing about this is, when we discuss about vagina, the derivatives are different. Okay, so you have to keep that point in mind. The endometrium, the lining of the cervix, and the musculature of the uterus all are derived. That is the cranial end of the uterovaginal canal. They are exclusively derived from the mesoderm. And you can see the upper end, the cephalic end of the paramesonephric duct. Once it gets separated from the coelomic epithelium, a part of it, the cephalic, the cranial most end will get degenerated and will form the fimbriated end of the uterine tube. Now we will discuss about the caudal end of the uterovaginal canal. So first we mentioned that the caudal end is actually solidified mass due to the proliferation of the mesodermal cells of the paramesonephric duct, that is known as vaginal cord. And it is actually bulging into the urogenital sinus as the Mullerian tubercle. Now what happens is, you can see that this is the urogenital sinus. Urogenital sinus is a part of cloaca and it is endodermal in origin. You hope you remember that the entire gut is endodermal in origin. Okay, so the urogenital sinus will also be endodermal in origin. So what happens now is, the endodermal cells from the urogenital sinus through the Mullerian tubercular region, it will grow into the vaginal cord. Okay, so this red colored thing, they are the endodermal cells from the urogenital sinus. They will actually grow into the vaginal cord and it will occupy the centralmost portion. So this centralmost portion, which is actually due to the proliferation of the endodermal cells, will form a cylinder-like solid growth, and that is known as, that cylindrical growth is known as sinovaginal bulb or vaginal plate. So what you can see here is, you can see in the middle, the central axis formed by the endodermal cells from the urogenital sinus, and the periphery, the surrounding region, it is actually from the mesoderm of the paramesonephric duct, which is actually forming the lower part of the uterovaginal canal. Okay, so this portion is actually forming 4/5 of the vagina. If you consider the entire vagina, length of vagina, upper 4/5 is actually formed from the caudal portion of the paramesonephric duct and the proliferating endodermal cells into it in the form of sinovaginal bulb or vaginal plate. And later what happens is, they will canalize. The cells will disintegrate and will canalize to form the vaginal canal. And these endodermal cells will extend beyond the cervix onto the lower part of the cervix, surrounding the cervix, forming the vaginal fornix. And this vaginal canal is communicating with the cervix through the external os. What happens to the lower portion? Lower portion, you can see that in the middle there are many endodermal cells coming from the urogenital sinus. Okay, so these endodermal cells will actually disintegrate in the middle to form a hymenal orifice. So the orifice formed in the endodermal cells in the middle of the Mullerian tubercle, that will form the orifice of the hymen, and the periphery, the rim of this Mullerian tubercular region, that will be actually formed from the paramesonephric duct. So that is actually mesodermal in origin. So the hymenal membrane is actually mesodermal in origin due to the paramesonephric duct, and the hymenal orifice is actually formed from the proliferation of the endodermal cells into the lower part of the uterovaginal canal. So if there is no perforation in these endodermal cells going into the lower part of the uterovaginal canal, there won't be any opening, and that is known as imperforate hymen. Okay, so there will be a small orifice developed in the endodermal group of cells which are invaginating into the lower part of the uterovaginal canal. So that is the position of the hymenal orifice, and that will be present in the newborn, but there will be a membrane surrounding this orifice. That is actually what we refer to as hymen or hymenal membrane, and that is actually the surrounding paramesonephric duct, the mesoderm of the paramesonephric duct. And what happens to the lower 1/5 of the vagina? That is actually purely developed from the urogenital sinus. Hence, that will be endodermal in origin. So, upper 4/5, the vagina has got two derivatives, that is the membrane, the mucosal membrane of the vagina, they are derived from the endoderm of the urogenital sinus, whereas the musculature, the walls of the vagina will be formed from the paramesonephric duct, which is actually forming the lower part of the uterovaginal canal. So that will be mesodermal in origin. But when you consider the lower 1/5 of the vagina, just now we mentioned about the upper 4/5, lower 1/5 of the vagina, they are purely developed from the urogenital sinus. So that will be endodermal in origin. So you have to remember that. So upper 4/5, you have two source of derivatives, that is mesodermal as well as endodermal, whereas lower 1/5, it is purely developed from the urogenital sinus, so it will be exclusively endodermal in origin. And the portion which is actually opening to the exterior, at that point there will be a membrane that is known as urogenital membrane, which is common for the urogenital sinus. So on the rupturing of the urogenital membrane, the lower part of vagina will be communicating with the exterior. So exterior, you can see the ectoderm. Okay, so this, when the urogenital membrane ruptures, the vagina will be communicating with the exterior, and on either side of this membrane, you can see the genital fold from which you have the labia minora developed, and lateral to the genital fold, you can see the genital swelling from which you have the development of labia majora. These are the external features which you will see. So, the lowermost end of the vagina, it will be opening into the exterior by the rupture of the urogenital membrane, and on either side of this membrane you can see the genital fold which will give rise to the labia minora, and lateral to the genital fold you have the genital swelling which will be forming the labia majora. So, uterus and cervix, it's very easy. It is developed from the upper part, the cranial end of the uterovaginal canal, and the events are occurring mainly at the caudal part, that is the formation of the vaginal cord from the paramesonephric duct cells. Then this cord is actually infused with the endodermal cells from the urogenital sinus to form the sinovaginal bulb and vaginal plate. Later it gets canalized by the disintegration of the endodermal cells from the urogenital sinus to form the canal, and the upper 4/5 is formed from two sources, the endodermal cells from the urogenital sinus as well as the mesodermal cells from the paramesonephric duct, whereas the lower 1/5 is exclusively from the endodermal cells of the urogenital sinus. And one important thing which I would like to mention is, till this moment, the cranial end of the paramesonephric duct was actually vertical in position. So what made it horizontal? You know that the uterine tubes are lying in the pelvic cavity as horizontal tubes, isn't it? That is due to the descent of the ovary. You can see the ovary here. While the ovary descends, the uterine tube which were vertical, uterine tubes which are vertical will actually become horizontal due to the pull of the ovary downwards. That is how the final position of the uterine tubes will be horizontal, and the opening is actually communicating with the peritoneal cavity, and this is the reason. So, in the initial period, it got separated from the coelomic epithelium and the cephalic end remained open. That is the reason why the uterine cavity is communicating with the peritoneal cavity. So, I think the idea is clear for you. You should remember the position, the hymenal position as well as the position of the urogenital membrane. Most of the times students get confused with the position of the hymenal orifice as well as the urogenital membrane, and most of them consider it as a single point. So it's not single point. When we talk about the development of vagina, the upper region is actually above the hymen, that is 4/5, and the lower region is actually, lower 1/5 is actually below the hymen, and they are developmentally different. So that point you have to keep in mind. So in another session, I'll be talking about the congenital anomalies of the uterus and the uterine tubes. Thank you. Thanks for watching.